I won't lie, this era might be the most interesting in human history, and yet no one talks about what made it so unique. At a time where borders and country names started to solidify to what we know today, and technology started to become somewhat modern and recognizable, one thing made that world back then completely alien to us. And that's the fact that coal was absolutely everywhere. It was unavoidable in day-to-day life, and then suddenly, it just vanished. And this is how. Steam engines permanently changed the game of history. Having the ability to automate age-old crafts such as spinning and weaving, many people previously living comfortable lives in the countryside could no longer compete and suddenly found themselves with no job and no income. Luckily, new jobs were springing up in a frenzy within cities, so these people flocked there for work, and each and every one of them must have been shocked at what they saw. Due to the nature of how steam engines work, the larger they were, the more efficiently they burned coal, creating an incentive to make bigger and bigger factories. You can only imagine how seeing these enormous structures and these smoke plumes bellowing out of them all along the city skyline must have been such an insane sight to see back then. But from now on, this was home. Once a job was found, a worker would quickly discover that each production step was broken down into its most basic tasks. Suddenly, people who spent their entire lives doing a variety of fulfilling work were reduced to cogs in a machine, repeating the same repetitive task for an entire day, which, by the way, was dictated by a clock. And to many of these people, the concept of time itself was a completely new thing, especially the idea that it dictates when you sleep, when you wake up, when you eat, and when you go to and from work. These were constraints that were simply never encountered before. Another new development was light. Taken for granted today, having a light at nighttime was too expensive for anyone but elites to afford for nearly all of human history. But with the introduction and proliferation of coal gas lights in the 1800s, factories were lit up at night so brightly that observers compared them to palaces. With this new technology, some factories even started to experiment with operating around the clock, which actually helped the laborers since it shortened down their daily shifts from 16 hours to just 12. Yeah, when I said they worked a full day, I meant it. Having a life outside of work didn't really exist. Due to how sudden and sweeping this societal change was, there were no laws to prevent any kind of labor abuse. As far as legislature went, it was still medieval. The result was, quote, the tightest daily constraints on personal movement and time that had ever been imposed on an entire class of people. It's really hard to overstate just how much of a shock being this thoroughly controlled must have been to people who previously lived free and autonomous lives in the country. But after living long enough in the city, they started to have children. And for those born into this industrial system, they found employment within 3 to 4 years of life on Earth. That is, when they were just 3 to 4 years old. And the toddlers weren't just doing adult jobs. The unique nature of the machinery allowed their smaller bodies to get where fully grown people couldn't. The result was that many jobs were created specifically for children. On top of that, employers found that they could be paid less and were easier to discipline. From an efficiency standpoint, they were in many ways the ideal worker. This methodology also extended into the coal mines themselves, which started to dig smaller tunnels that only children could use. And the abuse that took place in these tunnels would make the child labor in factories look like sunshine and rainbows in comparison. The following quote will evoke a mental image that is akin to a horror movie. Chained, belted, harnessed like dogs in a go-kart, crawling upon their hands and feet, dragging heavy loads behind them. This was all taking place in darkness lit by a single torch in a mineshaft so small they couldn't even stand upright. And you might be wondering, why did their parents send them into this? Well, to the adults who sent their children to work, they knew no better. The thing is, kids have always worked for all of human history, contributing to the family in small ways such as farm work or washing clothes. You need to understand there was no education system that was preparing children for work. They simply just started working. But now in this industrial world, the only way one could really contribute was financially, working for an employer. So instead of having them sit around at home, they sent them out into the factory system without fully realizing the life that they were depriving them of. This new class of industrial workers, uprooted and traditionalists, was an alarming sight to the upper classes who were sure that they were witnessing an emergence of, quote, a fresh race of beings, both in point of manners, employments, and subordination. And in a way, they were right. In these tightly packed cities, no space was set aside for parks or any sort of greenery, and this absence of nature must have been sorely felt. Even the one last bastion of nature that we can all rely on, the sun itself, managed to be blocked out of the sky completely at times due to the overwhelming mass of black coal smoke. A newspaper once reported that people could barely be seen from just 2 yards away. Dark coal soot covered absolutely every surface, roads, buildings, and clothing, which became nearly impossible to maintain any sort of cleanliness. Unless, of course, you were rich. Yet, despite being able to see barely in front of you, this world was becoming more connected than ever as another marvel of the industrial age started to transform Britain, the steam engine. By 1852, there would be 6,600 miles of railway spanning the entire country. People could now ride between major cities within a day, a miraculous advancement. But to some, they knew something was deeply wrong with this life. So they got through their day-to-day existence saving up for a dream, a one-way ticket to a country that actually used to be a colony of the crown, a place where the promise of freedom and adventure rang across the ocean, the United States of America. You can imagine how, to people living in those horrific, controlled, cramped conditions, the promise of a place full of open nature, adventure, and most importantly freedom sounded extremely appealing. A return to the old way of life they felt robbed of. But there was only one issue in that department. As the states became more established, they continued to expand westward. Amidst the conquest of land, they surveyed exactly what resources they contained, and what they found was something that would change the course of US history, just as it did in England. You guessed it, they found coal. Due to where the deposits were located, the Industrial Revolution within the United States started with a small trading village called Pittsburgh, which grew throughout the Revolutionary War. In just 8 years after that war ended, with a population of 376, the city hit a mark of industrial progress unique to only a handful of places in the world at the time: its first pollution complaint. Within the next few years, it would become a major manufacturing center for fuel-intensive industries such as glass and ironworking. By 1817, it had a population of 6,000 and over 250 factories. Just like British cities, visitors started to report that the smoke was making the city gloomy, blocking out the sun. And just 20 years later, Pittsburgh became the steam capital of the Western Hemisphere. But as of now, this industrial phenomenon was happening in isolation. Elsewhere in the United States, the revolution was on hold. But that was all about to change, because the cities on the East Coast were starting to run into the same exact issue London did 2 centuries ago. They were burning so much wood that they were running out of trees, driving up the price and making coal a viable option. But there was just one issue. The infrastructure to transport simply wasn't there. Unlike England, they couldn't just sail down the coastline. The coal was all inland and needed to be brought out to the coast. So instead, they took another route that the English experimented with: canals. Massive digging projects sprung up all across the country, creating paths connecting cities to rich coal deposits. And once the technology was there, another British innovation started to make an appearance: railways, which, as they saw more play, became so closely intermingled with the coal trade that they were often considered a single industry. With the infrastructure now in place, new cities sprung up all along these routes, places such as Minersville, Newcastle, and Port Carbon, the latter of which started with a single family and grew to over 900 people within just a year. It's safe to say at this point that there were only 2 things necessary for civilization: coal and water. And with the United States' major cities being plentiful in both of those things now, the following decades, that being 1835 to 1855, the US found itself in the same predicament that this video started with. Mass migrations from rural areas to industrial cities took place in massive quantities. By this point, the country was so far industrialized that they were producing some goods that even the English admired. But this economic success wasn't evenly dispersed throughout the country. Coal and everything that came with it helped point out a glaring economic divide between the industrial North and the agricultural South, which depended on slave exporting plantations. These tensions eventually exploded into a civil war. It's here where we could really get our first glimpse of a war powered by coal. Railways were co-opted for military use, allowing for a constant stream of both men and munitions to the front line, enabling larger and bloodier battles. The common use of large-scale ironworks also allowed for the battle testing of a new class of ship, the ironclad. It was also showcased just how decisive an industrial advantage was in warfare. The North had 10 times more factory production, 32 times more firearms production, and a whopping 38-to-1 advantage in coal. The writing was on the wall. By the end of the conflict, 600,000 Americans would die, the most deadly civil war in human history. And that was just the beginning of what was to come. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the US continued to chug along and develop as a nation, mining more and more, eventually surpassing and in the process dethroning the king of coal, Britain itself. Come 1890s, the United States became the largest coal producer on Earth, and by 1900, this gap would grow wide enough for coal to definitively be the foundation for the country's economic power. And ranked just beneath Britain in coal production, in third place globally, was a rising industrial power by the name of Germany. But some people were starting to get fed up. Throughout the next decade, the big story surrounding coal was actually an early movement to combat pollution. But it's not at all for the reasons you might think. Back in 1842, a bombshell report found that children born in the laboring class of Manchester were more than 57% likely to die before the age of 5, making the average life expectancy just 17 years old. To outline just how bad this is, the poor in the countryside had an average lifespan of 38 years old. That is over double. It was now obvious that something about city life was killing people, especially the poor. But society was largely in denial. The smoke in cities was seen as a feature of human civilization by this point. A life without it seemed simply unimaginable. Some theories were being drawn to the lack of sunlight leading to the deaths, but with only primitive ways of measuring it, no causal link could be made. And there were also genuine arguments at the time that smoke actually purified the lungs and made them resistant to bacteria. For this reason, the first real anti-pollution movement didn't emerge from the men who ran scientific communities, but instead, it came from their homes and the women within them. At a time where domestic duties were seen as solely a woman's job, it became harder and harder to keep their homes, food, and family clean. As previously mentioned, smoke soot was everywhere, and this started to be seen as a problem. Soon, women started to form groups and become vocal about it, starting what would go on to be called the municipal housekeeping movement. But because they were women, and often women of privilege, their call for cleaner air was seen as something sentimental and not to be taken seriously. In Pittsburgh, there were commonly accused of wanting to protect their complexions rather than their health. But these girls were in the trenches getting stuff done. They worked with engineers to find technologies that burn fires more efficiently and cleanly, and despite having no right to vote, successfully lobbied for new laws banning dead smoke, which is quite an accomplishment, as successfully outlawing the coal industry in the United States is not an easy task to say the least. But the thing is, this anti-pollution movement can only work in a stable, peaceful society. Since coal was now completely intertwined with warfare, if a war were to break out on a large scale, all of these lofty aspirations would need to be set aside. And that's exactly what happened. In 1914, a war started. Initially, it was thought to simply be another Balkan War, but within the span of just a few months, it turned into something completely unrecognizable, something unprecedented within the written record of human history, a world war. In line with the efficiency-focused factory system, the colorful uniforms of the Napoleonic era were officially a thing of the past. German units marched into France and Russia in dreary columns of monotone gray, building rail lines along the way as they pushed further into enemy territory. The ironclads of the American Civil War forced navies to modernize and push the envelope further on ships made of metal, culminating in the massive Dreadnought-class battleship. Machine guns started playing an instrumental role in the battlefield, and artillery pieces grew immensely in scale, distance, and caliber, culminating in what we know the war to be: a meat grinder of mud, bullets, and barbed wire. Later on, the economist John Maynard Keynes would go on to say that the German Empire was built more truly on coal and iron than blood and iron. And there's a very specific reason for that. Coal didn't just provide fuel production and transport. Its hydrocarbons were used for a substantial portion of the chemical industry. The most deadly weapons on the battlefield were coal products through and through, as were many of the medicines and disinfectants used to treat millions of soldiers in hospitals. The First World War was more dependent on coal than any war in human history. And through a series of unfortunate events, the coal Goliath of the United States was eventually dragged in, and production soared to meet wartime demand. This actually caused the largest coal shortage in US history. It was so bad that during the winter of 1917 and 1918, some schools were closed down for weeks due to an inability to combat the cold. When it was available, it was rationed. Many uses of electricity, such as outdoor lighting or taking an elevator below the third floor, were completely forbidden. And most infamously, daylight savings time was introduced nationally to make better use of the sun's light. By the end of the war, estimates on the number of deaths, specifically the civilian part, can be quite varied. Despite this, both numbers, even today, over 100 years later, are genuinely impossible to comprehend. Together, military and civilian casualties are estimated to be, on the low end, 15 million, and on the high end, 40 million. That is the true power of industrialized warfare. But once the war was over, peace wasn't what the United States found. Like other workers, miners had come out of the war with an expectation of a more just world, and that just wasn't what they returned to. The result was the country entering a period of unprecedented labor unrest. In general, America's history of labor relations with coal miners were rocky at best. Since the beginning, they were certainly the bloodiest. Oftentimes, strikes were met with beatings, shootings, and even straight-up massacres of unarmed civilians, in a few instances at the hand of the United States National Guard. This prompted the resurgence of the country's oldest labor union, the UMW, which in 1933 truly made history by securing a contract to improve miners' lives, scoring things like wage increases, less mandatory work hours, safety requirements, and job security. These were landmark victories in the US that would forever change the course of the labor movement, not just within the country, but globally. The leader of the UMW was John L. Lewis, considered a hero for the common working man, who would fill entire stadiums of supporters cheering for him within the following years. In fact, it was commonly agreed that he was the nation's second most powerful person after Franklin D. Roosevelt. But World War II changed that completely. And that's because, at least in the eyes of Americans, he got too greedy. Even after coal miners were among the best paid industrial workers in the country, he continued to push them to strike and fight for more. And each strike created a national coal shortage, driving up the price. You can imagine that over time, this started to rub Americans the wrong way. And the final straw was reached when a strike occurred while America was knee-deep in the Second World War. A war that, just like the first one, needed coal to produce many essential items for the war effort. This move was seen as deeply un-American and akin to sabotage. And come war's end, John L. Lewis found himself near the top of the list for America's most hated public figures. Talk about a fall from grace. And with each and every strike he caused, another thing occurred. More and more of the energy market started switching to coal's direct competitor, oil. This was also mostly due to the fact that the modern world was simply becoming more compatible with oil than coal. Back in the day, in a world of wagons, trains, and ships, sure, coal was convenient to transport because it could simply be loaded on top of things. But throughout the early 1900s, infrastructure was being laid across the globe for oil transport. Pipes and oil tankers started to be used quite a lot, making oil significantly cheaper and requiring less manpower to transport. And of course, another thing that made the case for coal a lot harder was the automobile. If you were to ask a coal industry analyst back in 1924 whether he thought cars were going to be a good or a bad thing for coal, he would have laughed at you and said of course it would be good, as the assumption at the time was that cars would run on it. But as we all know, that's not what happened. And these oil-guzzling machines started to pop up all over the place in droves. A story I've actually covered on this channel, so if you're interested in that, a link will be in the description. And even throughout World War II, almost all trains were running on oil as well. Coal was simply being used less. During the war itself, coal still accounted for around half of US energy consumption, but then it started to fall in both absolute value and total percentage. By 1955, it had plummeted to just 29% of the nation's energy use. But by all means, this was not the end of coal. It was simply the beginning of a new phase of business, one where the commodity would be removed from the forefront of society and would instead exist largely behind the scenes, out of sight, but certainly not out of mind.